Welcome to the Open Apple podcast, where we celebrate the Apple II. Whether you're a long-time user, a nostalgic visitor, or a newcomer to the community, join us as we share news and memories of Steve Wozniak's most famous personal computer.
Hello and welcome to Open Apple. This is episode 46 for April 2015. I am your hostess with the mostest, Quinn Dunkey, and with me as always is my co-host Mike. How you doing, Mike?
Hey, Quinn, I'm doing all right. How are you?
Excellent. Lots of good Apple II stuff to talk about today.
Yeah, I got a bunch of news items that we can cover, but first we've got a great interview, I think, that people will really enjoy. Mr. Paul Lutus is joining us. Paul, of course, authored the first Apple II word processor, AppleWriter, and the WPL language that went along with that, and he wrote TransForth, and I think it's pronounced GraFORTH.
Yeah, GraFORTH, yep.
Okay, and an ALD, which is an assembly language program, and yeah, we're really excited to have him on the show, so welcome, Paul. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So I know that you got started with NASA and JPL, or at least that's kind of where the biographies that I read about you online sort of start. How did you get from there to Apple II writing stuff?
Well, during my career as an engineer, which predated my time as software developer, I became aware of the fact that that things happen very slowly in the engineering world. It took a long time to put something together and make it work. And I started fantasizing about how it would be if I could have a symbolic version of engineering where instead of bolting things together and soldering things together, you could actually just write a mathematical equation. And so I imagined the spectrum, between hardware and something beyond software, just pure mathematics. And all my life before the personal computer arrived, I imagined how much easier it would be if it could all be done symbolically. Because what I was doing was assembling these gadgets that were meant to accomplish some symbolic end. And I was pretty good at hardware engineering. I worked on the space shuttle. I designed high-efficiency 20 kilohertz inverters for the NASA space shuttle fleet. And that was fun, but it took forever. And I always thought that, as I said, that it would be nice to have something that was more cerebral. So as time went by, computers started intruding themselves into my work in a very favorable way. Like I could anticipate how a circuit would work by handing a set of 80-column punch cards to the computing center. And 3 days later, I'd get a result, and I'd go, oh, that's how that's going to work. Well, that's interesting. And I got accustomed to how long everything took. Okay, so after my shuttle work was finished and the shuttle was launched, I decided to retire. So I bought a cheap piece of land in Oregon and started living in the country. And I had a little garden and I had chickens and a rustic cabin with wood heat and a kerosene lantern. And that was fun because I had gotten tired of living in cities. So I had a bicycle, I didn't own a car, and I just had a very minimal existence. And I had the grand total of $3,000 in the bank, which I expected to last forever. Then in 1977, I was reading Scientific American one evening by a kerosene lantern, and there was an advertisement for an Apple II. And I've been spending the day looking at some of my old Apple equipment in the basement, and I just rekindled in myself the memory of how exciting the thought of having your own personal computer. See, now, the young people, it's nothing. It's just a given that you can get a personal computer or a tablet or whatever, and you can solve all kinds of problems that occupied our minds in those days completely. But the idea that I could have a personal computer and pose mathematical problems was just incredibly exciting. And so I instantly ordered one, even though it used up more than half the money I had at the time. And it arrived, and I started playing with it. And the first thing that happened to me was the collision of reality with the world of dreams. I sat down and the instruction sheet that came with the computer said, to enter BASIC, type Control-B and press return. I must have typed CONTROLB 1,000 times before I realized that they meant something completely different then. And so I wrote them a letter after I got underway and began to be successful with the Apple II. I wrote them a letter and I said, you need to explain this differently for people who've never seen a computer before, which they did. I have in front of me the Apple II reference manual, which is the so-called Red Book. And they more or less word for word took my advice. And they said, hold down the Control key, press the B key, release the B key, then release the control key. For people like me. Anyway, so I started writing programs, and I had plenty of free time. Then a magazine wrote me and said, next year is Einstein's centennial. We'd like an article about relativity. At that time, I had written a lot of science and technology articles, and so I said, oh, that sounds like a great opportunity. So I started writing this article about special relativity. I limited myself to special relativity. Pretty soon I had little pieces of paper all over the room with bits and pieces that I realized that I needed to get together in exactly the right way. It reminds me a little bit of a story about John McPhee. John McPhee, I found out later, supposedly worked exactly the same way. He had a whole bunch of index cards, and when he was preparing an article, he would just put an idea on an index card and put it in his pile. And then he had a big table, and he'd rearrange the cards, try to figure out what order to tell the story in. Anyway, so there I was. And I went, whoa, wait a minute. I have a computer now. I could probably write some kind of a program that would organize all these things on the screen of the computer rather than on these pieces of paper. And I could move them around and delete something from one place and put it in another place. So pretty quickly, two projects got started at once. I started writing this organizer program, this word organizer program, and the article that I had a deadline to complete simultaneously. So I would spend some time writing the article and go, I need this feature. Then I would switch over and write some software and then go back and forth. So I was the customer for the first version of AppleWriter. I was the user as well as the software designer. I got the program, which I called Lexicalc, up to a certain level of sophistication. And I got the article done and I submitted it to the magazine. And then I had a friend visit or something. Anyway, Apple heard about the program. And by then, Apple couldn't sell Apple IIs to hobbyists anymore. They saturated the hobbyist market with a lot of happy owners, by the way. But still, they wanted to branch out and sell computers to people who weren't advocates and early adopters and hobbyists, just ordinary people who wanted to be sold on the idea of owning a personal computer. In order for that to happen, they needed finished apps. They needed things like spreadsheets and word processors. So they wrote me and said, do you have this program? We've heard this rumor about this program that's sort of like a word processing program. I said, yeah, I do. So they expressed an interest, so I spiffed it up a little bit more and put it in a big manila envelope, rode my bicycle to the post office. And as I put the envelope in the post office box, I said, gee, I hope they like my program. Maybe I can make $100. And they liked it. And the first version of AppleWriter sold for $7,500. I sold it outright. I didn't know better. And Apple took it and stripped out my copyright notice and sold it as an Apple product for a while until they realized that there were all kinds of things that were happening with the Apple itself. Like suddenly it could show upper and lowercase, and it had an 80-column wide screen after a while. And nobody at Apple could figure out how to accommodate these improvements in my program. So they came back hat in hand and said, this could actually be a much better program. We don't have the people with the required. Oh, by the way, I left something out. It was written in assembly language. It wasn't written in BASIC or in any other high-level language. That made it fast. It made it small. It made it really efficient. But it also meant that unless somebody had a particular kind of skill set, they weren't going to be able to make any changes in the program. I said, yeah, okay, we can start over, but you know what? I've made a lot of changes in this program, and it isn't really the same program anymore, and I have some new requirements. One, you can't take my name out of the program. It's going to be my program. If you sell it, it's going to be sold under contract, and it's going to have my name and my copyright notice on it. And two, I think royalties is a better idea than an outright sale. They were delighted with this. They weren't so happy about the first, but they were delighted with the second because they didn't have a lot of money at that moment. So they said, royalties, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. That means we don't have to give you any money up front. I says, that's right, no problem at all. And so they said, okay, what royalty rate are you interested in doing? I said, I don't know. I haven't known anything about these things. How about 25%? And they said, sure, why not? 25% sounds good. 5 years later, after I had made $6 million on AppleWriter, they were going, we gave that guy 25%? My God, that was so stupid. But they tried to get me to reduce the royalty rate, but no dice. Okay, so that was the basis of AppleWriter. As the years went by, it was issued in 5 languages, and it was able to support upper and lowercase. And I added the word processing language, WPL, which automated a lot of things. People could even do form letters. This was pre-internet, by the way. So somebody who was interested in spamming everybody in the world, they had to do it on paper. which greatly reduced the dimensions of the problem, as you can imagine. They had to do it instead of just instantly, sending out gazillions of emails at no cost. They had to create a piece of paper, put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it. So I didn't feel so bad about allowing this. So if a person had an address list, they could actually create form letters and punch in the addresses using my tiny little program, which fit into this tiny amount of memory. And I'm emphasizing this for a reason. Most people in the modern world, they go, "What? Less than a terabyte? What's wrong with you?" In those days, my first Apple II, the first version I bought before I upgraded it, had 4 kilobytes of memory. And after I wrote a few programs, the Apple people said, "These are nice little game programs. This is good. And be sure to keep them below 4 kilobytes because the majority of our users only have 4 kilobytes of memory." It's hard to imagine from a modern perspective how I squeezed anything into that small amount of memory. But one of the reasons was it was assembly language. And if you spend a lot of time and are extremely patient, you can squeeze a lot into that because there's no overhead. It's all the native tongue of the computer. Okay. Now we'll get to the Apple III. First, I have to say this. I just went down into the basement and looked at my Apple II, which I still have, my original Apple II, which is now mounted on a board with a long ribbon cable to another board that has the keyboard mounted on it because I couldn't stand the idea of having the keyboard near the system unit. I needed to have notes and stuff in front of me. And every integrated circuit in that machine is in its own separate socket. And the reason was, in those days, those integrated circuits were quite expensive. And it seemed a shame to throw away an entire motherboard because of the failure of one IC. So the failure rates were higher and the integrated circuits themselves were more expensive. By the time the Apple III was being designed, there was about to be a big turn where integrated circuits became less expensive. The efficiency with which motherboards could be wave soldered and created without sockets was about to be a huge engineering change in the way computers were designed. And I think the Apple III was either the last or nearly the last major project that used socketed integrated circuits because it was a disaster. Again, I was just reading the Red Book, the Apple II reference manual, and it mentioned that when you got your unit in the mail or by truck, you should take the cover off and resocket all the ICs that had fallen out of their sockets before turning the power on. And I thought that was good advice because that was a very common experience. The difference being the Apple III had more integrated circuits. And so more ways ironically enough, more ways for that failure mode to occur, for integrated circuits to fall out of the sockets. And it was harder to locate them all and reseat them all because the unit was larger and it had more sockets. So as far as I was concerned, it was a failed design. And that was something that that occurred to a lot of other people at that time. Anyway, I wrote a version of AppleWriter, which was fairly easy to create because there were so many similarities. One of the objections to the Apple III, by the way, was that people heard a lot of advanced press, and they got the idea that it was a completely different kind of computer with a different processor and a different architecture. But it turned out to be an evolutionary change from the Apple II, not a revolutionary change. It was very much like the Apple II. It was just an enhancement. Anyway, I wrote a new version of AppleWriter. Most of the parts of the program were transferred unchanged, except the file handling, which needed to accommodate the new operating system, the sophisticated operating system. And the people at Apple asked me whether I would be willing to go through the SOS, the sophisticated operating system, for the display as well as file handling, so that it could be managed by the operating system rather than having me go directly out to the hardware. And I was down in Cupertino and I showed them the problem. The problem was the overhead created by the operating system prevented the display from updating quickly enough to be usable for a word processing program. So I actually wrote a version of AppleWriter for the sole purpose of talking the Apple people out of this idea they had that I would be obliged to go through the OS. And they went, "Oh my God, this is unbelievable." They would press a key and then 3 seconds later, the new character would appear on the screen. So they realized that wasn't going to work. So they gave me carte blanche, which, by the way, in the stories I've read about the Apple III, this is a bit obscure. I think they're trying, a lot of the people who were involved with the project in those days have sort of tried to make it sound as though that didn't actually happen, that I went along with the operating system requirements, which was partly true. As far as file handling is concerned, I did, because that was a very good thing, because all I had to do was submit a buffer full of characters and a file name and a pathway, as is true now, and everything was fine. The only problem was it didn't work that well for the display. So I think that's something that's obscure, and I want to say up front that they gave way entirely and said, we want this program to work as fast as humanly possible, so we're giving you carte blanche to go all the way around the OS and talk directly to the hardware, just as you did in the earlier versions of AppleWriter, which I did. So all the versions of AppleWriter, including those for the IIe and the other versions of the Apple II that came later, all talk directly out to the hardware. Okay, so you can start asking questions.
That's quite a bit there. You sent along a link to the cottage computer programming article that you wrote a number of years ago, and I was just glancing through this, and in one of the final paragraphs here, you wrote, overall, I believe the computer age favors the individual and that resistance to the individual work style is the last gasp of the dying industrial age. And I'm as I'm reading this, I'm seeing a lot of really positive optimism about the future of computers as a tool to better people's lives. 30 years or so down the road, do you still feel that way? Was that potential realized?
Yes, more than ever. In both respects, that article made 2 points. One, an individual has a role to play in software development, and two, there's some very positive ways the computer will affect the human species, and I think both are still true, more so now than ever. With regard to the first, the individual as a software developer, one can look around now and say, oh, brother, boy, was that a misguided notion, just because of the number of team projects that are out there. And the way that modern software development is arranged to accommodate all kinds of different people working on the same project by having a huge gap between implementation and interface, as one example. But I've written a lot of successful programs as an individual, and it's really much easier and quicker than attending a lot of committee meetings and trying to figure out a consensus on various ways that a project can go forward. It doesn't work very well for large projects. Like, I don't think that my work style or the work style of an individual software developer, not to say that I'm the only one by any means, can accommodate a huge program like an operating system. Even Linus Torvalds now is a small cog in a big machine. But it's also important to point out that he created the first version of Linux single-handedly. And once it was successful, its potential became obvious. It was then that other people got involved. And I think that the frustration that Torvalds frequently exhibits might be an indication of how tough it is to work in a committee environment. Not that necessarily that's a bad thing, because people should learn how to get along with each other. But in the future, I think computer languages will be efficient enough and powerful enough that an individual wanting to solve a problem will have an easier and easier time doing so because of all the resources that are made available in increasingly sophisticated computer languages. I'm thinking at the moment of the most recent versions of Python now has some fantastic libraries of programs. For example, one library is able to solve rather sophisticated mathematical equations, things that one used to have to order up a copy of Mathematica, install it, and run it in order to do the same sorts of things. But this is a real trickle down. Some of these libraries are really powerful. And in a recent project, mostly mathematical, that did optics, that allows people to design optical systems, I used Python's version of equation solvers to solve some really sophisticated equations as part of the work, and it sped the project up tremendously. Even though the project wasn't written itself in Python, I needed to write it in Java so that it would run on a lot of platforms. But when it came to solving all the equations and getting them all into the different forms I needed, I just used Python. So Python, for me, is an example of where very highly specialized libraries are written to ease the way for an individual working alone to create a really nice program without necessarily having to write all the bits and pieces down to the detail level that I had to write back in the old days. Oh, I should say something about the arc of my career. When I was a teenager, I designed vacuum tube circuits. Then I designed transistor circuits. Then I designed integrated circuits. Then I started doing more and more mathematics in order to design integrated circuits and other circuits like the ones on the space shuttle. Then I started designing programs rather than hardware. I switched into software. And now I get to do mathematics, which is probably what I wanted to do in the first place.
That's quite a road to have come down. The philosophy that you're talking about with the Python libraries and making it easier for people to get their jobs done, is that what went into your decisions when you were writing GraFORTH and TransFORTH?
Yes, that was a very good question. That was exactly what I had in mind. I wanted to do the grunt work for people so they could draw pictures and do mathematics with accompanying graphics in GraFORTH, and because I realized that most people who would like to do that sort of thing wouldn't want to go into the detail level. And in those days, it was a bit more difficult because I had those two examples you gave were both written in assembly. One of them was written in, both of them were written in Forth, which as far as I was concerned was assembly, because I had to write all the libraries in assembly, and then the interface was Forth, so that users who used the programs could create Forth words one after another that would refer to the underlying assembly. But basically, it was assembly to Forth. Nowadays, when people write Forth interpreters, they don't necessarily have to go all the way down to assembly to accomplish what they need to do. In those days, it was necessary. There was no lower level to appeal to, including floating point. Everybody takes floating point for granted now. Isn't there a floating point processor in all the main CPUs now? Which is true now, but I've watched that come into being. And when I wrote my first examples of floating point packages, I had to write them from scratch. They were written in assembly. That was hard.
Did ALD, the assembly language package that you wrote, was that to help you write Forth?
That's right, exactly. No, yes, I ended up writing Forth programs in it, but it was my way of speeding up the assembly language development, because as far as I could see at that point when I wrote it, it was going to be assembly for a long time to come before anything more sophisticated came into being. And that was before the PC. It was before the IBM model PC. It was before floating point packages became a given in a processor. So everything had to be done, essentially I had to do everything in assembly. Now, all the modern languages, which are extremely efficient, including C and C++, C#, etc., they all call the floating point processor, coprocessor, which we used to call a coprocessor. I don't think it's called that anymore. That's all taken care of. And whenever anything goes wrong with that coprocessor, there was a famous story about a decade ago where Intel had allowed an error to creep in, and it influenced floating point computations in banks and that sort of thing, and it was a big deal. Believe me, that was a big deal. Intel almost had to take back the chips they had sold already.
That's right. The original Pentium had an infamous floating point bug in it.
That's it. That's the one. Anyway, that's a lot of change. I can't even begin to describe moving as far as I've moved since the time I was a teenager, and I expected to be designing vacuum tube circuits as a living. But by the time I was no longer fixing people's television sets, which is what I did when I was 13, and started actually designing things professionally, vacuum tubes were almost all the way out the door. And so everything after that was just gradual, and sometimes not so gradual, transition from one technology to another.
Can you talk about your electric duet?
Oh, yeah. Electric Duet was a program that even though the speaker in the Apple II was connected to a logic gate, in other words, it was either turned on or turned off. There was no analog intermediate levels. At first, I learned how to make it play tones, which were square waves and very ugly sounding. And then as time went by, I realized that because of my background, I could change the volume and the pitch of the sound by changing the duty cycle of the square wave. So if I made the duty cycle narrow, the spectrum changed, but the volume also changed. So I realized I could actually change the volume coming out of the speaker on the Apple II by changing the duty cycle of the square wave that was driving it. The next thing that occurred to me was that I could have a complicated square wave with two parts playing two different notes at once, where the square wave would devote half of its duty cycle to one of the tones by going up and down, and the other half of the square wave would play another note. And I made that work. And then I said, wow, now what I need to do is create a player that can play accurate notes according to the chromatic scale that were actually in tune, two different notes at once, of different timbres, without going out of tune. And what I realized that I needed to do, because now in modern times, all you do is send some instructions to a sound card, and the sound card has its own separate clock, so you don't have any timing difficulties. In those days, the program that was creating the music was also the program that was picking up the next note to play and deciding what to do next and listening to the keyboard and everything else. I ended up writing this amazing piece of code, if I say so myself, that was a couple of 100 bytes long. and it did everything. It played 2 notes. It cycled through. It knew how long to play the notes for because it was given those instructions by the data file, and it never changed the amount of time to pass through the subroutine from the top to the bottom was the exact number of machine cycles every time, regardless of what was going on. And that was very difficult. If I made a branch from one place to another, the branch had to be executed without changing the total time the loop took to go through oh man, I just remember how tough that was. Anyway, and so the people at Apple, naturally enough, there's no way that could possibly be true. And then I mailed them a copy and they went, I can't believe he did this. By the way, that program had a finite life. As soon as they introduced interrupts, as soon as there was a mouse on the Apple II, it stopped working because the interrupts just spoiled the timing. And as soon as there was any other clock speed than just over 1 megahertz, that also did it in. So it was a program of its time. There are demonstrations now on the web that show how Electric Duet worked, but they, of course, don't have interrupts and they don't allow the clock speed to change at all. Otherwise, it spoils that program. So there's an example of a program, which I now realize is true for every program, that it had a finite lifetime. It was completely dependent on the hardware it ran on. And as soon as I released it, everybody went, wow, amazing. And then the clock started ticking. And within 5 years or so, or 8 years at the very most, it couldn't be played anymore. And people would look back on it and go, well, that was an interesting interlude.
Quinn, you've been kind of quiet over there. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I got a couple. Well, Paul, let me start by saying that reading about it by Kerosene Lantern in a magazine is the most interesting story of Apple II discovery that I've heard. You said that you wrote AppleWriter in your cabin in Oregon. Is that right?
Right. I had built a cabin on top of a 400-foot hill, kerosene lanterns would heat, and I decided that I wanted to program up there also. At that time, I was going back and forth between Apple and my cabin because as Apple's interest in my programs accelerated, I needed to go back and forth. Finally, the royalties started coming in from AppleWriter, and I bought an airplane. And so what I would do is I'd ride my bicycle to the local airport, put my bike in the airplane, fly my airplane down to California, and ride my bike over to Cupertino to get things accomplished. Oh, wow. Anyway, so I have 2 stories about that. One of them is, in order to operate the Apple II in my cabin on the hilltop, I had to run a long extension cord. That extension cord, that was 1,200 feet long and it ran through the trees. It was the ugliest thing you ever saw. And if an electrical inspector had ever seen it, he would have had a heart attack on the spot. But the other story is the day I came down with a program, an early version of AppleWriter. And I said, I'm going down to California with this program on floppy disks, and floppy disks are notoriously unreliable. So I made 2 copies. I just make 2 copies just to be sure. And then I went down to California, rode my bike over to Cupertino, and said, here's my new version of the program. So Steve Jobs took one of the copies and said, I'm going to lunch. I'll take this for safekeeping so it can't get messed up, and you guys can mess with the other one. So he went away for lunch. And somebody else said, okay, I'll take care of this. I'll make a copy right away. So we'll be sure to have at least one more copy. So that person took the copy and put it in a drive and put a blank disk in the other drive. Unfortunately, he got them backwards. So he erased my program disk. Instead of making a copy of the program to a blank disk, he made a copy of the blank disk onto the program. Oh. Meanwhile, Steve Jobs is out having lunch in some nice restaurant, and his car is out in the parking lot in the hot California sun, and the 5¼ floppy disk is sitting on the dashboard of his car, crinkling up. It crinkled up into a little ball under the extraordinary heat of his nice car. Anyway, so he came back and he said, I've got bad news. And I said, we've got worse news. So what did I do? I got a scalpel and I cut open the shriveled up disk from Steve's copy. And it turned out that the medium inside the 5¼ floppy was of much sterner stuff than the envelope. So it hadn't crinkled up as much anyway. So I was able to extract it and put it into a fresh new uncrinkled 5¼ floppy disk, which I had cut a slice through the side of to allow me to introduce the medium, and it was readable. So that saved that. That was the only time in my life that I've seen Steve Jobs in an apologetic mood, ever. I really didn't like him very much, and he was rather imperious. But at that, came back with this disc in his hand, and he said, "Oh, this is not so great." Which I think there was universal agreement on that point.
Well, good thing you had the backup then, that's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm interested in the WPL language in AppleWriter. That must have been a pretty early example, if not the first example, of a macro language within another application like a word processor. Where did that idea come from?
I have to say that I think it was a very early example, but because I was personally involved in it, I'm probably not the right person to say whether it was the first, but it was an early example. And basically, you may already know this, but each of the instructions for word processing in the WPL language was a period followed by a 2 or 3 letter code right in the text file along with the text. So, for example, if I wanted to center a block of text, I would just have a couple of letter code. And so what that meant was that if you had a period against the left margin followed by some letters, I think I had a way to allow it to be printed out as regular characters unless it met the requirements to be one of the valid codes. I hope that was true. I must confess that I don't remember anymore. But the idea was that if it was one of the codes that had a special meaning to AppleWriter, it would be executed as an instruction, as a command rather than as text. And it was plain text. It was easy to read. It was easy to understand. There was nothing binary or obscure about it, all deliberately. Obviously, I wanted it to be really easy to understand, for people to understand. And it did a lot of things. It didn't just format the text. It allowed the introduction of an address, and there would be a separate file consisting of addresses that would be passed through sequentially. As I mentioned before, you could do an address list, a mailing list. And that was having a mailing list on the Apple II with somewhere between 24 and 32 kilobytes of memory. I think people were shocked by that. They thought that was pretty slick.
Yeah, that is cool. And I think those dot codes went on to be sort of a standard of sorts. I remember using them with various types of printers, and I remember first encountering them in AppleWriter, and then they
that's right. That's
showing up everywhere.
It turns out that became the standard for a while anyway. Before WordPerfect came along and reintroduced obscurity.
That's right. Yeah, it made a lot of sense because there, of course, would not be any reason for a period to be at the start of a line. So it was very...
I have to throw in a philosophical note here. People who write programs for sale tend to have codes that are obscure and only their own and concealed from the user as much as possible. WordPerfect was an example of that. But even though I was selling AppleWriter and becoming rich because of AppleWriter, I still wanted it to be as easy to use as possible. Oh, I should say something else about that. As soon as AppleWriter became successful, all I could think about was having a free version that I could give away at schools. And so I inquired with Apple. I said, could I take a version of this program and tear out some parts of it that aren't absolutely essential for a student, like printing? And could I give it away in schools? And they said, sure, yeah, we could. And I think the reason they agreed with it is because they realized it was a great introduction to the full-fledged program. It would be a lead-in to the full-fledged version. And all I could think about was the fact that kids in schools had Apples, but they didn't have any reasonable programs to learn how to type and learn how to do word processing. So they allowed me to do that. Unfortunately, my program FreeWriter, which I called FreeWriter, somebody grabbed it and called it FredWriter and charged $10 for it. And so FreeWriter disappeared and was replaced by a program that somebody just went, hey, he's giving this away, so therefore I can have it, and I'm going to sell it. So they took it over.
Yeah, I remember.
That was my first introduction to the problems of what constitutes a free program and what are the intellectual property rights and issues of copyright. That was so long ago that the idea that a program or a book or anything else was copyrighted intrinsically without a copyright notice was a new idea, or else it hadn't even come along yet. I don't remember which, but it was still novel. And the market for software was much smaller then, and I didn't actually realize that was going on until a long time later for the reason that I was out on a sailboat sailing around the world.
So that might lead into my next question, which is what happened after your Apple II? Like, what was the last thing you did on your Apple II, and then what happened to the machine?
Yeah, I had... basically, AppleWriter and a number of other programs, including Apple World, which was a pretty popular program in those days. Apple World was a 3D visualization program that was quite primitive, but because of the fact that the Apple II was out there and it wasn't very expensive, and because people hadn't seen programs like that very often, it became very popular very quickly, and I even was on national television describing it on the air on the old Tom Snyder show, which, of course, greatly increased its sales. So that was actually Apple World. I must tell you, Apple World was my first bestseller before AppleWriter. It didn't really make as much money, but it was still, I made me aware of the fact that I was forced to confront the fact that I could influence what people thought about computers as well as make some money writing programs, because I had to recalibrate my thinking at that time, because up until that point, I was just thinking how much fun it was to have a computer and write programs. I wasn't actually thinking about making money until I started making money. And then naturally enough, I started realizing that my bank account, which by then was $500 or something, was going to be a big improvement in my lot in life. Anyway, I'm sorry, I may have lost the thread of what you were asking me.
So is your Apple II still around somewhere?
Oh, yes. I have my Apple II, which is actually now, it's sitting on a board, and there's a ribbon cable over to another board that has the keyboard mounted in it, because in those days, I wanted to get the system unit out of sight. I didn't need it. All I needed was the keyboard and the display. And now I look at the first generation of personal computers that all had remote keyboards. And it wasn't that they got the idea from me, because I never showed it to anybody. It was just that I thought it was a good idea, and apparently other people did too. And I just looked at it today because in preparation for this interview, I tried to get my a mindset looking back at those times. And I did actually look around at the various things that I looked at today, and the primitiveness of the Apple II, and the fact that this huge motherboard, it's covered from one end to the other with chips, was only able to support 16 kilobytes of RAM. It's just astonishing how things have shrunk.
If you have any pictures of that machine, I bet our listeners would love to see that. It sounds, both.
Oh yeah, okay.
Early Apple II, by the sounds of it, and
I could definitely provide pictures. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't some pictures of it out there in the world. But I have some actually in my files.
Well, that was all the questions I had. Mike, do you have any others?
Yeah, I had a couple. We'd like to ask this of. We've had a few guests in the past that have spent some time around Apple and the personalities at that time. Did you spend a lot of time talking to Woz or anything like that?
No, actually, Woz and I got along famously, but we didn't really spend a lot of time together because the way we both worked was very much the same, and so we didn't actually require much time together to figure out what to do next. Steve, on the other hand, was a problem, and I have to say about Steve Jobs that when I knew him, he was constantly struggling to be noticed because everybody who showed up said, "Are you Steve Wozniak?" "No, I'm Steve Jobs." "Okay, where's Steve Wozniak?" Wow. And I think that affected him, and I think as time went by, he had a well-concealed inferiority complex about his role in a technology company because he was just not, the cutting edge of what was actually taking place. He could promote what was taking place, but he couldn't really meaningfully contribute to it, in my opinion. I think that other people differ on that subject, but in my view, he wasn't actually on the cutting edge of what was taking place. He was able to get people excited about computers and promote them, but he never really made very much in terms of actually contributing in a technological sense, contrary to what a lot of people think, I might add.
It's always interesting to hear the perspectives of people looking back at what people were like back then, because as I understand it, Jobs got pushed out basically because people couldn't stand him anymore.
Yeah, that's correct.
Came back and turned Apple into this, multi-billion-dollar biggest company in the world.
Yeah, that's a complicated story. I think one of the reasons. Remember, this isn't science, that we can't isolate the effect that Steve had on the company from other issues that were going on. Like, for example, the people who were running Apple before Steve came back, I'll just say this as a theory, not a fact, not a statement of fact, but one theory is that they were doing such a bad job of it, they were driving the company into the ground, and anyone would have been a better alternative. At that point, he reappeared, and a lot of people liked him who were outside Apple, who only heard him give speeches about how great computers were, which is something he was really good at, I must say. This is an insanely great product that you want in your living room right now. And this is a revolutionary product. It's not merely evolutionary, and other similar things that he would say. And so that's a little hard to say whether he actually was the reason for the big turnaround, because the people who were running the company just before he came back, they weren't technology people at all. And Steve, at least he understood some of the issues with personal computers because he'd been with Apple since the beginning. So that's a muddy one. And most stories like that we hear about any company, or changes in the economy, or anything having to do with society, are tainted by the fact that they can never really become science, that you never get to the point where you can say A caused B without any doubt about it. That's a tough one, because a lot of people who know, A, we're living in a scientific time in history, and B, science has accomplished many great things, that doesn't necessarily mean C, that we can analyze social changes on the basis of scientific analysis. That isn't necessarily the case.
So at what point did you got on a sailboat and went around the world for a couple of years?
Yeah.
What motivated that, and how did that come about?
What Apple realized was they were paying me a lot of money, and they didn't want to do that. And so they contracted with another programmer to create something called AppleWorks, which was actually a better program. And as the author of AppleWriter, I can say right out front without the slightest hesitation that AppleWorks was a better program. It had a spreadsheet. It had a database. It was better in every way. And Apple owned it. They were hiring this guy on a salary to write this program. And so AppleWorks came along, and Apple was really tired of paying me a couple or $3 million a year for AppleWriter royalties. They just thought that was outrageous. I didn't think it was outrageous, but I'm spoiled. Anyway, they introduced AppleWorks, and they pushed AppleWriter out of their own marketplace. And so that all happened around 1985, 1986, thereabouts. And I went, well, that's okay. I don't mind. I have enough money now. I can retire, which I did. The funny part was between 86 and 88, when I started sailing around the world, Apple came to me and said, would you like to take over AppleWorks? The guy that originally wrote it for us is unwilling to cooperate with us anymore. And I said, oh, well, that depends. Are you willing to give it to me and pay me royalties? No. So that was the end of that story. Oh, I have another story that I have to get in about this. Around the same time also, IBM called me up and said, we know about AppleWriter and how successful it was. We want something like AppleWriter for our new personal computer, the PC, our entry system. And I said, okay, we can talk about that. But first, let's talk about the business angle. I think they were surprised by that. I think they thought that they were going to be talking to a programmer and not a business person. But I went right into the business mode. I said, what kind of a business arrangement are you thinking of? Before I even talked about the code, because by then I had been through it so often and been ripped off so often that I was completely transformed into half business, half programmer. So they said, okay, here's our normal deal that with all our programmers, it works like this. We pay you $100,000 in royalties, after which we own the program. And I said, wait a minute, $100,000, that's about 10 days worth of AppleWriter royalties right now. And there was this long pause on the phone line as the meaning of that sank in. And I guess we agreed not to agree, and nothing came of it. Then they went to John Draper and made him the same offer. Now, I've heard this story through a number of different channels, and I can't verify that it's true. All I can say is that I heard it a number of times. And he wrote a perfectly terrible program, which IBM sold until its terribleness became obvious to everyone, and they voluntarily withdrew it. And then John Draper was rumored to have said, look, they asked for a $100,000 program. I gave them one. Anyway, so after AppleWriter wasn't being sold anymore, I wrote a few more programs, but I decided to do something that was a perfect thing to choose to do at that time in my life. I was 40 years old. I was approaching 40 years old. I decided to do something I'd always wanted to do, was learn how to sail and sail around the world. I bought a small sailboat, learned how to sail it, and starting in 1988, from 1988 to 1991, I sailed solo around the world in a small 31-foot sailboat. That was when, I mentioned before, when Fred Writer was becoming popular. I had no way of knowing because I was out of the country.
Yeah, that's an interesting piece of the story. I remember Fred Writer. I had no idea that it was just an illicit copy of your free program.
Yeah, it was basically a free writer with some printing things written in BBSing or something that were added on, and this person put it on a disk and offered it for sale without bothering to consult with me or acknowledge whatever. It's just outrageous. It was completely outrageous.
Yeah, that's
and in those days, things like that just went by. I don't think I would let the same thing happen again now, but I was, as I said, I was doing something else, and I wasn't very experienced at that. Copyright issues and ownership issues were just things that maybe I didn't think very much about in those days. Besides, my original intent was to give away my program, so maybe I was a bit confused about exactly what Fred Writer meant. Now it's clearer. It's somebody who wanted to make money off of a free program. Since then, I've had a number of similar episodes where people would take one of my free programs and try to offer it for sale.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah, whatever. I don't actually understand it, but one of the things that I use to explain that to myself is that if a person is young enough and they see that something is free, they draw the conclusion based on their inexperience that it means they can take it and sell it if they want to because it's free. And I think that's just something that they have to get more life experience to realize that that isn't true.
Do you still actively develop software?
Oh yeah. I have some Android apps. I have 4 Android apps on the Google Play Marketplace. By the way, I was going to comment about that. When I wrote programs for the Apple, for example, we were talking about Electric Duet. And Electric Duet, everybody out there who might get a copy of Electric Duet, they all had exactly the same machine with exactly the same clock speed, the same display, similar amounts of memory. It was this gigantic marketplace with identical machines. And Android is the opposite. If you write an Android app, it's a nightmare. There's all these different display sizes and even different processors. If you really want to cover the waterfront in Android, you have to compile your app, if it uses any native code anyway. You have to compile your app in a bunch of different languages to accommodate different processors, which is why Google is enthusiastic about having people write their apps entirely in Java, because then that issue doesn't come up. I've got one app that's very popular, unfortunately, that requires some native code, and it won't run under certain Android devices, only on those that have the whatever the most common processor is on Android. It'll only run on that one. And it's an example of an app that you can't do what it does without native code. So I had no choice about moving away from Java, which otherwise I would have written it all in Java because it makes it much more portable. By the way, I do a lot of Java writing, and Java is a language that a lot of people don't like for a number of excellent reasons. But it is portable, and it is out there on a bunch of different platforms. So if I want a program to be portable without having to just worry about portability issues and different versions, because until I started writing in Java, I started having different versions of apps that I was trying to give away, and it was a great nightmare to make them all work the same way. So there's a lot of interesting languages like Haskell that I haven't even begun to try to experience. And Java seems rather dated and old-fashioned, but it does have a virtual machine on virtually every platform out there. So that's nice.
So when you were preparing for your interview today, did you turn your old Apple II back on?
Nope, didn't do that. I've actually done that from time to time lately, but that's another story. When I first got my Apple II, the storage device was a cassette player, and it would store maybe 16 kilobytes from one end of a 60-minute tape to the other, and it took forever to read and write. And it was a total nightmare. And so I actually negotiated with Apple. I said, I'll give you this program if you'll give me a floppy drive. In those days, floppy drives were $500, more than the cost of a PC now. And it was a floppy drive that would store 140 kilobytes. Wow, 140 kilobytes. I was just took your breath away. Your heart beat a little faster when you heard that gigantic number of storage capacity. There's transportation experience. It's just amazing. So I flew down to California and I got them to give me a floppy drive, which there was a rare commodity in those days. I mean, it was a prototype. It was still in the prototype stage, but I knew it would greatly speed up how I accomplished what I was doing. So I basically gave them some program that I thought was pretty cool, and they did too, in trade for one of these drives, which I couldn't just buy it. That was the deal. It was a prototype. I could have given them $500, but I didn't want to. That was a tremendous breakthrough. And then the next thing I discovered was, and I'm saying this for the young people in the audience, you would take this 5¼ floppy drive, which had a little plastic membrane inside it, and you'd slide it into the drive, and you'd close the little door. And when you closed the door, the read-write head would smash down on this little plastic thing, and the drive would spin, grind, which meant that the disks had a finite lifetime. So if you made a backup disk, you had to make a backup disk of your backup disk pretty quickly, because they would wear out so quickly, because they were in physical contact. The read-write head was smashed down, pressing against the membrane inside that was spinning at high speed. It was just, from a modern perspective, when I first got one, I thought how sophisticated and modern and terrific it was. But looking back on it, now that I know that most hard drives, they have a little airfoil surrounding the head, and the head never touches the medium inside a modern hard drive. It just flies over the top of it. And the whole thing is filled with nitrogen so that the moisture issue isn't an issue, et cetera, et cetera. And even those drives are being phased out by SSDs. It's just phenomenal to think back at it, especially the cassette player. God, that was a pain. I would go, well, it's time to back up again. Gee, I'm glad I have several hours to do this. And I would put a new cassette in the player. And then things like worrying about that extension cord going through the trees, because I'd be writing new code. Oh, another story. I'm writing the code for AppleWriter, thinking to myself, gee, it's about time I should really do a backup. And I'm writing away. Meanwhile, outside my cabin, the wind is picking up and the rain starts to fall. And I go, oh, great, this is going to be a distraction. It's very noisy on top of this 400-foot hill when the wind and the rain started. And then lightning hit a tree near the house. I'm not making this up. I didn't get a direct lightning strike on the cabin, but there was some peripheral electricity in the air that caused the Apple II to reset itself and zapped all my backup disks. I found out later. I didn't know it at the time. Zapped all my backup disks on the table. And the Apple II went from showing a screen full of text of the most recent line of code I had just typed in to this monitor display where there's an asterisk showing and a hexadecimal address and a flashing cursor. And I went, oh my God. Okay. So I went, well, there's one possibility that it just was a glitch and it didn't actually erase the memory of the computer. So I typed in a special instruction that entered my program, and it did enter my program, and the same page came back up. So that was as close as I came to actually losing something. Another story about that, because of the dollar value of AppleWriter, after a couple of years of dealing with that and similar backup experiences, which gradually improved. Nevertheless, I would, when I created a new version of AppleWriter, I would put some copies of these floppy disks, these horrible, unreliable floppy disks, in an ammo can, which was waterproof, and bury it outside the house. No kidding. And the reason was, if the house burned down, too bad, I've lost my cabin. But I don't want to also lose my multi-million-dollar program. So I did this ritual where I would bury ammo cans. And this is a lot of your listeners may not know what an ammo can is. It's kind of a rectangular steel can, and it has a waterproof seal around the top. And when you close it, it's got a really firm latch, and it's actually waterproof. You can drop it in the water, and it'll stay dry inside. So I chose that, and I would put 2 or 3 copies of whatever the most recent version of my program was, and I would just bury it outside, bury it in the ground. I never actually needed those copies, but it was a good idea anyway.
Are they still buried up there?
I wouldn't be surprised.
That could be the Apple version of the Atari dump dig.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, have a metal detector farm experience out there with people looking for these artifacts of bygone eras.
Very early example of offsite backups, I guess.
Yeah.
Off-surface backups.
All right, Paul, so where can our listeners find you on the web and internets? And
Arachnoid.com. My website, which I am constantly adding things to, is arachnoid.com. ARACHNOID.com. I have this rather pragmatic attitude that if I'm going to write a program and I want it to be noticed, then it might as well have a name that starts early in the alphabet.
Makes sense.
So arachnophilia. I've never written a program that I can remember that's anywhere near the end of the alphabet. I haven't written any program starting with X, Y, or Z. And I want to emphasize once again that when I thought I could own a computer, it was such a shock because I had always imagined, like an if-only kind of a thought. If only I had a computer, well, I could solve this kind of a matrix problem. It would be much simpler, blah, blah, blah. And I did that for years without ever thinking about the fact that it might actually come to pass. By the way, another thing I should mention is that for about 5 years before the first personal computer appeared, I was writing programs on programmable calculators to solve some of the problems I was so desperate to solve, both in work and just out of intellectual curiosity. And I had a slew of programmable calculator programs that I had published in magazines, where people had got the magazine and then typed in the instructions, maybe 40 or 50 instructions, into a hand calculator in order to run the program. It was even harder than cassette drives in terms of read-write. It was such a pain. But people were willing to do it because it meant they could solve certain kinds of problems that were otherwise impossible to solve.
That's interesting because I know that Woz was working at HP for many years in their calculator division.
That's right. Now that you mention it, I had forgotten that. That's true. The old HP, everything was absolutely as close to perfection as they could get it. And HP had a fantastic reputation among engineers that was deserved. And now HP is just another company. They've given up on the picture that I had of HP, that everybody had of HP in the 60s and 70s, was of the top line, high quality, leave nothing to chance, terrific company. And now they're just another Me Too company out there. They've basically sold their birthright. Too bad.
And now they make inkjet printers.
Yeah, not very good ones.
Yeah, commodities.
And they're putting their brand on things that they buy from third parties, which is a very common practice.
Didn't they bought DEC at one point and Compaq?
Yeah. hoping to turn them into commodities, but for one reason or another, they didn't work out. Oh, one more. After the royalties came in, and I was up in the multi-million-dollar range, I said to my accountant, this is ridiculous. I'm going to give most of this. I have enough money now to be retired and be comfortable. I'm going to start giving any more royalties away to charity, various charities that I wanted, Planned Parenthood in particular. And my accountant said, you can't do that. I said, what? You mean I can't do that? You mean I'm forced to take this income? I said, yeah, here's how it works. After you give away half your income, you have to pay taxes on the remainder, regardless of whether you've given it away. In other words, you can only deduct as charitable contributions 50% of your income. I hadn't heard that one. And so what that meant was that if I gave away more than about half, in those days the tax rates were higher, I'd end up paying more in taxes than I actually had left over as income for that year. So I had to give up on that idea. I thought that was extremely weird, and it was one of many things I learned about money during those years that I naively thought I knew about money until I actually had it. Discovered that I didn't actually.
Paul, thank you for joining us on Open Apple. It was definitely great to hear your perspective on early Apple history and your experiences with the application development and the people that were involved.
You're most welcome. I was really glad to take part.
All right, so that was a great interview actually with Paul Lutus, and we didn't have to do a whole lot of work, did we? You just tossed him a ball and he ran with it.
Yeah, interesting guy with a lot of really interesting stories, so we sure appreciate his time.
It may be old, but there's still news. Apple II news.
For starters, probably one of the best weeks in Apple IIgs history.
Boo, boo. I'm kidding.
You're just sad because there's no Transwarp 3.
Yeah, I'm a little broken up about the fact that I can't accelerate my Apple III past like 1.2 megahertz or whatever it is. So,
well, it certainly accelerated itself into obscurity. Oh, zing! Thank you very much. But as if anyone hasn't figured it out yet, we are of course talking about the clone of the Transwarp GS that ReactiveMicro has been toiling away on in their salt mine of awesomeness, and it's finally available. Very, very exciting.
This is not the first time that a Transwarp clone has been promised, but it looks like they're actually going to deliver, unlike the past efforts. And I had a discussion with Sean Fahey, who's kind of been there doing a lot of PR for ReactiveMicro recently, and he talked about how they did have to shave down one of these things. And I know that they haven't put a price on it yet or anything. It's definitely still early on in development, but he did point out that, there's a lot of silicon on this board and it's not going to be, $85 for one of these things. On the other hand, it will be a reliable source if you want to get one, and it's going to be new equipment that's backed up by a warranty, and so you're not dealing with maybe I got a broken one from eBay, maybe it works, maybe it's only goes to 8 megahertz and I can't accelerate it past that. So I'm looking forward to playing with one of these.
Yeah, this is a huge win for the community. A clone of the Transwarp has been a unicorn for so long. Like you say, it's been promised and talked about, and people said it couldn't be done for a long time. I personally thought it probably couldn't be done. I thought it was just too complex, and there was too much custom silicon on it. But boy, hats off to ReactiveMicro. They really nailed it. The pictures of it, this is a real thing, are available online, and of course we'll link to that in the show notes. So this is very exciting. Even if it comes in a little less, I'm sure it'll be less than what they go for on eBay. They go for just silly money on eBay. And
these days, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so even if it's anywhere below that is a huge win, because like you say, for the same or less money, you're getting a brand new product that will work. And it looks like they're all going to 16 megahertz too, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
Because, of course, the old Transwarps, some of them could be accelerated up that high, but it depended a lot on, how lucky you happen to get with the quality of your particular board and, how good some of the chips and traces were and so on. So since these are, newly engineered and brand new products, they're ship-shape. Yeah, this is going to be fantastic.
And we are lucky enough here at Open Apple to Henry's going to be shipping, Henry Corbis of ReactiveMicro is going to be shipping us a preview unit, and I will get to play with it.
Crumble.
I would have recommended that he send it to you, except that somebody left her GS up in Calgary. So.
Yeah, well, I could put it next to my 2C Plus, and they could be friends.
So, I'm definitely looking forward to playing with that, and we'll have a report on an upcoming episode. I'm sure there will be plenty of pictures. I know I'm not the only one that's going to get one, so look, Sean will get one, and I think maybe Stavros is on the list, and a couple of other people. There will definitely be pictures and reports as they get closer to release on that.
Yeah, and I'm sure it will make an appearance at KansasFest this year.
Oh, yeah.
And as if that wasn't enough, the fountain of awesome that is ReactiveMicro continues with their newly produced version of the no-slot clock, which for people like myself actually is going to be great for 2Cs and such. If anyone isn't aware, of course, the no-slot clock was this chip that you could stick in your Apple II to give you a clock. And as is suggested by the name, it didn't use a slot, which was quite a big deal at the time. And again, this is one of those things that it's super nice to have. I think we forget nowadays because, of course, we take it for granted that computers have clocks in them. Well, of course they do, but they didn't used to. And so if you're dealing with file systems and so on without a clock, it's a bit of a hassle to, there's no dates on anything, and it's a nice thing to have, and it's another one of these things that goes for ridiculous money on eBay. And of course, the additional gotcha with these is that they were those old Dallas style clock chips that if they still work, the batteries in them, if they still work, then they wouldn't for long, or they would be leaking. So that's definitely not, unlike the Transwarp, that's something where you really probably don't want to buy it online, honestly, because the 20 or 30-year-old ones are not going to be reliable. So this is very exciting, and I'm definitely going to be on the list for this one.
Dallas Semiconductor, they were purchased by Maxim Integrated, I think, back in 2001 or so, and they actually continued to make these up into like 2005 or 6, and when they were finally discontinued. And there are vendors on eBay that do have large collections of these, and they're selling them, and you can get those for $10 to $20, but you never know whether you're going to get one of the newer ones or one that was produced back in 1981. The battery's dead. And the additional good news about Henry's version is it's a low profile, so it will fit in your 2C with a memory card, which was not possible with one of the Dallas boards. So that's a really great thing. And it has a replaceable battery.
Yeah, it's a super nice design. We'll have the photos of this in the show notes as well. Using the sort of the power of modern components, which are much smaller, they've managed to sort of squish everything in between, the rows of dual inline package pins. And so, yeah, the replaceable lithium battery and the clock chip and everything are all just sandwiched right in there, and it has the same vertical profile as a regular dip chip. It's really, really, I love the design of this thing.
Yep, and the other item that everybody's talking about that is coming from ReactiveMicro is the scalable oscillator for the Transwarp GS. So the way this works is you pop it in there and you put your super fast oscillator chip in there, and then it has a bank of dip switches that you can use to set it at whatever speed you want. I think it steps by like 1/4 of a megahertz at a time. And I know Stavros, I'm sorry, Stavros, I don't know how to pronounce your last name. He's got one running on his Zip GSX as well. I think he had to modify it a little bit or put some spacers in there or something, but it will work on that board. It's nice because this saves you from having to have like a drawer full of different oscillators if you want to play around with the speed. I don't know I think for most users, what's going to happen is they'll buy this, they'll find a speed that they're comfortable with, and then they'll never touch it again. So, but if you're a tweaker type and you like to play around with stuff like this saves you from constantly swapping in and out these oscillators. You can't set it in software, so you have to power it down and set the dip switches and then bring it back up. So there is that. It does sit a little bit oddly on the Transwarp board itself, so it's kind of hard to get to when you're doing this. And Henry when he sent me one of these, fortunately, he sent the kind of the beta version of the instructions, which has a chart that tells you how to set the dip switches for the speed you want, because if you don't have that, there's this weird math formula that you have to follow. And if you lose this chart, man, it's you can do the math, but you really want to make copies of that chart and turn it into PDFs and post it everywhere you can, because it is a bit complicated setting the speed that you want if you don't have that in front of you.
Yeah, this thing is really kind of an overclocker's dream. I'm sure, as anyone knows who's tried to overclock anything, really, it's very much up to chance and the weather and the quantum details of your particular device as far as how high it goes. So you really need, or you want something like this where you can kind of turn up the speed until it breaks, essentially, and then turn it down a notch, and that's where it'll sit. So without having to buy handfuls of oscillators and mess around with soldering and so on, this is a very cool thing to be able to just plug in and dial up your GS and just see how high it'll go. And then, like you say, you'll probably find a speed and leave it there, but it's still a great tool for finding that speed.
Absolutely. I'd kind of forgotten just how great ReactiveMicro is. They're not a sponsor of the show or anything. I just love their products. And I remember kind of, when they shut down, how disappointing that was. But, as time passes on, you kind of just assume that, that's not available to us anymore. So when they come back and they come back with these great products, it's sort of like a refreshing, cool drink of water to be able to have this again. So to the guys who are behind this and doing the work, we really appreciate everything that you're doing for the community.
Definitely, ReactiveMicro has come back into the Apple II community like a hurricane, and they've just dropped these products that are just incredible. By the handful, they're just dropping amazing products on us. So this is just fantastic. Great time for Apple II.
Yeah, and speaking of great times and great news, there's some KansasFest news. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I am just tickled about this. I'm so excited. When they released this news onto the KansasFest mailing list, I was bouncing off the walls. They've announced the keynote speaker for KansasFest 2015, and it's none other than Rebecca Heinemann, who might be better known as Burger Becky. She's just a legend in the Apple II community, game developing. I think most people probably know her for her 2GS contributions. Of course, most recently, Wolfenstein. But, she also did Bard's Tale and Dragon Wars and Crystal Quest and Task Times in Tone Town. She's just got a rock star Apple II resume, and I'm a huge fan. So this is just really, really exciting.
I am excited and looking forward to hearing her keynote, because I follow her on Twitter, and she participates in the KansasFest list and a couple of other Apple II resources. I think the Apple II enthusiast group on Facebook, and it's always great to hear her stories and the about the effort that went in kind of behind the scenes on the different projects that she worked on. I think she also was a big part of that effort to port Ultima 1 to the 2GS. There was a specific 2GS version of Ultima 1 that was released, and she was part of that. So yeah, I can't be more excited to see this.
Yeah, she's one of these people that I describe as quietly awesome. She's out there doing this stuff and maybe isn't getting a lot of attention for it, but then you look at her profile, say on LinkedIn, and you realize just how extensive her resume is. Or on the Apple II enthusiasts group, this happens all the time. People are talking about some great game or whatever, and she'll just pipe in and be like, "Oh yeah, I wrote that." It's a thrill. So honestly, second to Woz. I mean, I can't think of a better keynote speaker for KansasFest, and I'm just really, really excited for this.
And of course, if you want to go see Becky in person for the keynote, you can do that. KansasFest happens in July. The dates have been announced. Registration is expected to open in April, so it may or may not be open by the time this actually gets posted. So, and when that does happen, we'll have that news for you as well.
And in case anyone missed it, the dates for KansasFest this year are July 14th through the 19th. So you should definitely head on over to the KansasFest website and sign up in April when registration is open.
And make your travel plans now, because it's cheaper to buy flights and tickets and hotel rooms than to wait until the week or two beforehand.
And both of your Open Apple co-hosts will certainly be there. Come and say hi.
Or throw rotten fruit at me or something. Say hi to her and throw something at me.
Yeah, you can. If you've ever wanted to send your hate mail to Mike in person, this is your chance, instead of just by email.
You can type it out and hand deliver it.
Yeah, that personal touch, you could even hand write it.
I'm sure that Quinn will be doing that, so you guys can join in the fun.
Yeah, I'm thinking about learning calligraphy just for the occasion. Just so I can hand write you hate mail.
Oh, that's wonderful.
But I don't hate what you've been doing over there at 6502 Lane. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, so a year or two, well, probably close to 2 or 3 years now. Time speeds up, I guess, when you get older. Bill Garber sent me a box of Don Worth's diskettes. Don Worth, of course, was the primary author of Beneath Apple DOS, Beneath Apple Pro DOS, Beneath Apple Manor. He's written a lot of really great, very important titles and work for the Apple II community. And a while back, he was cleaning out his basement and garage and gave some stuff away on Facebook, and Bill got his discs, and I got some manuals, and some other people got some stuff, and Bill decided that he wasn't going to have time to deal with those, and so he sent the discs to me, and they've been sitting on my shelf collecting dust until a week or two ago, and I decided, it's probably time to put these out there where they're actually useful to some folks. So I have this device side data makes a board called the FC5025, 5.25, get it, which is useful for, you can use a PC compatible 5.25-inch drive, plug it into this board, which will then plug by USB into your Mac or PC, and it'll image your Apple II discs. So if you don't want to deal with firing up your Apple II and using ADT Pro, this is an alternative. The problem that I had was that this board doesn't really do error handling all that well. If it runs into an error, it does have it is robust enough to say, there's an error here, and continue to finish the image, so you don't lose the whole thing. But what happens is if you have a disk that's got bad sectors, you'll end up with dead files in the disk image. And unfortunately, a lot of the disks Don sent me had these errors in them. So some of the data is trashed, but I was able to go ahead and post they're somewhere just fine. This box had the original text files that Don wrote when he was putting together Beneath Apple DOS. There's the Beneath Apple Manor source code, which does have a bad file in it. And some of the other games and things that he published through Quality Software and through his own company. Those are now available if you want to go take a look and play with them. I don't know, because of the source code problem, like for example with Beneath Apple Manor, you can't compile a working copy from that, but you can at least look and see mostly what he did there. So kind of feels like it feels nice to be able to preserve a little bit of Apple history there.
I really like looking through the source code for these old software packages. There's always a lot to learn. And this is, I think, really neat that you've got these, original word processing documents. Of course, we've got PDF scans of the final published versions of these books. Mm-hmm. But you so often or so rarely get to see this original, draft in the original word processor format that the book was written in. So I think that's just a really fun little bit of archaeology.
Yeah, it's sort of a way to, like you said, there's all these documents that we scan now are PDFs of printed final copies or even preview copies, and that's great. There's it's wonderful to have those, but it is fun when somebody didn't handwrite something or type or do it by typewriter. He wrote it in a word processor, and you can actually go through and look at the files that he was working on at the time with these disk images.
I like stuff like this just because it's really early examples of personal computers being used for real work. I think so many of us, our only experience with these machines was playing games or the occasional school paper. So this was, real work for real money that was done on these really early computers. And, it's, what's the word I'm looking for? It's, I guess it's like the archaeologist wants to find the clay pot with the chipped edge and the initials carved in it and the old food in the bottom. They don't want to find the pot on the, on the shelf in the store because that's not interesting. Right. So a pot that's dinged up and has food in the bottom tells a story of someone's life. And to me, that's kind of what this is. This document tells the story of someone spending quality time, real time with the computer and using it for something that made their life better, made their work more efficient. This was better than a typewriter. This was better than handwriting it. This was real progress being made with really early computers. Very exciting. Yep.
Obviously, this isn't something you're going to necessarily want to print out and try to make your own manual with because where in the printed versions of Beneath Apple DOS, there are diagrams, and in Don's text, it says simply, insert image 1.1 here. So, You're not going to get that, and there are some typos in there. He wrote it in a program called PyWriter, and what's nice about PyWriter is that Paul talked earlier in the show about using the dot commands and things, and PyWriter had a sort of a crude version of that, and you could chain the files together. So as you're hitting spacebar to page through this, you only have to load up the first ch1 chapter 1 file, and when it comes to the end, it'll just load up the next chapter, and you can keep right on reading.
Yeah, safe to say if you want to read the books, just go get the PDFs and read the books. These are
Right.
just interesting as historical artifacts, I think.
So thank you, Don, for making those available to us to preserve and put out there for people.
Definitely. So I was playing with a Raspberry Pi a little bit today, but looks like I could be doing something Apple II related with it.
Ivan Drucker, also known as IvanX, has updated his A2 server, A2 Cloud, and Raspberry 2 to work on the Pi A Plus and the new 2B boards. I guess they were different enough that they warranted an update, and you can get those now from his website.
Yeah, he's given me a difficult decision now because I have a Raspberry Pi A Plus that I actually won at KansasFest last year. And so a little full circle here. And I've actually been using it. I recently, like we were talking about earlier, or before the show here, Mike, I recently got a 3D printer for my birthday. It was happy birthday to me from me, love me. And I wanted to get something. I wanted to get something ridiculous and impractical that I would never normally buy for myself. So I bought a 3D printer. It's a lot of fun, and I'm using my Raspberry Pi to manage it. So this is a common thing that people do. They use the software called Octoprint that will run your 3D printer without a computer attached to it, which is a good thing because 3D printers are very cool and precise and neat, but fast is something they are not. And so complex prints often take many, many hours, even days, which is not something that anyone ever tells you when you're looking at these things, is how slow they are. Anyway, Octoprint on the Raspberry Pi is a cool way to deal with that problem. And so I've been using it for that, but now I want to use it for A2 Server and A2 Cloud. Thanks a lot, Ivan. Now I might have to buy a second one.
Well, fortunately, they're only $35 or something like that.
That is true, yes. What an age we live in. So in other news, a new version of PeerSoft is now available. This is a very cool little AppleSoft programming utility that lets you do a lot of stuff in AppleSoft that you normally wouldn't think that you could. For example, it has support for interrupts. So if you want to do mouse stuff on your Apple IIc or vertical blank interrupts on your later IIcs that have vertical blank interrupts, you can do that in AppleSoft with PeerSoft. And
handy.
Yeah, it's very cool. And he's also got symbolic pre-computed go-tos and go-subs in it, which are much, much faster than AppleSoft's interpreted ones. For anyone who isn't familiar, the way AppleSoft actually does go-subs and go-tos is actually really, really slow. It actually scans from where you are in the program down, looking for the line number. So as many hardcore AppleSoft programmers know, forward go-subs and go-tos are always faster than reverse ones, because if you go-sub or go-to backwards in your program, it has to scan through the entire program and then go back to the top and keep scanning until it finds that line number. So it's very inefficient. So he's got these pre-computed ones that don't have to do all that. Very nice little utility. So if you're a serious AppleSoft programmer, you should definitely check it out.
And the 1.5 update has just been released, and he's got some new features in there, and we'll have a link to the A2 Central page where he's got a post that talks about the specifics there. But I think it's really great to see. Again, this is another example of a programming tool that has not only just been put out there for use by the community, but continues to be supported and updated by the author. And I think that's really great.
This is coming from a fellow out of France. Lots of cool Apple II stuff going on in France.
Yeah, it's got to be those Brutal Deluxe guys.
Yeah, they're spreading their influence.
I don't think Benoit is part of Brutal Deluxe, but vive la France.
Yeah, France seems to be the one European country where the Apple II really got a foothold. Especially the 2GS was very well loved there. It seems like most of Europe was really more into the Commodores and the Amigas and to some degree the Ataris. Yeah, the Apple II definitely found a home in France.
It's interesting to see those the geographical, I guess, influences, if you want to call them that now. Like you said, it caught on big in France and pretty big in Australia, but not so big in some of the other surrounding countries. Very, Very interesting.
There's a lot of history there. I'm sure it has to do with various aspects of whatever particular deals the companies could get in different markets, and to some degree probably how well they supported different languages. I know they made, for example, bilingual Apple IIs for Canada. When I was growing up, we had the bilingual Apple IIs in our classrooms. And it was cool. You had a little switch under the keyboard that would swap in an alternate character set. It would overlay part of the character ROM with accented characters. So it would replace certain curly braces, and other rarely used characters would get replaced with, the accent aigu and the accent grave and stuff that French uses. And it was a neat little thing. So, I imagine the fact that existed made the Apple II much more usable in France and other French-speaking areas.
Quebec, we love you.
As a sort of not exactly Apple II related, but I recently read that the reason that the Atari 8-bits, for example, were so popular in Poland, of all places, was because Jack Tramiel was trying to find new markets. When he was running Atari, he was trying to find new markets for the Atari 8-bit machines, and there hadn't really been any penetration in Europe yet. And he was from Poland himself, and so he had business connections in Poland, so he was able to get the machines in there for a low price, very inexpensively. And that created a legacy. There's a large community there to this day. Apparently a lot of the best Atari 8-bit stuff comes out of Poland. So I think a lot of those types of miscellaneous connections between people and companies are a lot of the reason why certain 8-bits landed in certain countries and not others.
It's always interesting to hear the inside story, years down the road as to why things happened, or, why a design turned out the way it did, or where these computers went.
So if I did have an Apple II with slots in it, which I don't at the moment, I would not be able to get a CFFA as much as I might want one, but looks like I might be able to get something else. Is that right?
Well, you could, briefly. Last month we talked about there was an ad placed in the, I don't know if it was an ad, but an image that was placed in the Apple II enthusiast group on Facebook announcing the coming of the classic IDE 2 from Technobytes, and not much more information was given than that. Well, since then, a couple of more messages have been posted and more information has come out, and on, I guess, March 15th, they opened a reservation list of 50 cards. They said this run would be for 50 cards, and it filled up in like a day or a day and a half, so you can no longer be a part of that, but you can still go to their website and sign up for a future list, and that will give them, that will indicate to them the interest as to whether they should do another run further down the road, because if nobody's interested beyond that 50 or 60 people, then obviously they're not going to make more. So just because you can't get on this list doesn't mean you shouldn't go and sign up. What this is it's an IDE board for the Apple II. It's based on Rich Dreher's CFFA 2.0 design. Cards are shipping from, I guess Technobytes is located in Brazil. And with the current exchange rate, it's going to cost you about $108 for the card and shipping. That's not bad.
Not bad at all. For anyone, I suppose everyone knows this, but IDE is, of course, a PC drive standard or interface standard that's typically used with hard drives, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I think probably the most typical usage pattern for this for an Apple II user would be to attach a compact flash adapter. There are trivial adapters that you can get for attaching compact flash cards to IDE devices. But I suppose you could also use it with an IDE hard drive if you were so inclined.
Yeah, and in fact, I think the first one of these for the Apple II, or at least one of the first ones, was the Focus drive that was sold. I forget the company that made it initially, because I don't have that in front of me. Tony Diaz now sells them through his 16 sector store, and what that was it was an IDE card, and it came with an IBM mini micro drive, or other. I think they could also get a Hitachi IDE drive with that, but those switched over very simply to using the compact flash card. I don't know if anyone ever then adapted it to the SD card, and I don't know if Tony is currently shipping that item, so it's nice to know that, and with the CFFA being sold out, that we do have, it looks like, another potential source, at least, that's shipping 50 units and hopefully more than that.
Yeah, this is good news. If you want a compact or rather, if you want a solid-state storage solution for your Apple II right this minute, we're a little bit light on options right now, with the CFFA being unavailable and this list being sold out, and Nishida Radio is on hiatus. So, there's the SD card, the SD floppy 2 from, I want to say Plamen is his name. I apologize once again for mangling your name, but we love your SD floppy 2, the fellow from Bulgaria that makes those. Those seem to be still available, but at the moment we're in a little bit of a drought of availability. There's tons of devices out there, but they're... production runs all seem to have aligned incorrectly at the moment. We're in a lowest common denominator period here where you can't seem to get any of them right now.
Well, there's also the S-Disk 2 emulator that we talked about last month and caused me a bit of confusion between that and the S-Disk floppy 2.
SD floppy 2.
That's it, yes. And so the one... The S-Disk 2 that's made from a gentleman in Korea, I think I had said his name was Lan Kim, but it actually is Ian. I think you can buy those from him still. He's also announced that he is working on a new Mockingbird compatible sound card for the Apple II. That's in development. It's not available yet, but he's got a nice little write-up on the development in progress on his webpage, and it's nice also because this isn't like a first-time developer who's announced something and we don't know whether he's able to deliver. Ian has made and shipped devices for the Apple II, so there's a pretty good chance that this is not just going to be vaporware.
Yeah, he's got a lot of really cool projects on his website. He's been flying under the radar a little bit. He doesn't get nearly the press that, Nishida Radio or some of the other sort of hobbyists / small-time producers of these parts gets. But he's doing a lot of interesting things. I wonder if he's... the Korean alter ego of the Bulgarian fellow, because they're both doing very similar things at the moment. I know that Plamen is also making some inroads into emulating or creating new sound-related devices for the Apple II. I think he's actually doing something slightly different, something more along the lines of like a symphonic type of card.
Sure.
But a new Mockingbird would be great. That's one of those unusual peripherals that are quite cool to have, but don't often come up on eBay. And when they do, they go for a lot of money. So.
I have this vision in my head that's sort of based on the old Pirates of Silicon Valley scene where Steve Jobs calls up Bill Gates and Bill flies down to his house and so that Steve can scream at him in the middle of the night. Where Plamen calls up Ian and Ian has to fly out there and listen to him being screaming about how he's stealing his Mockingbird device. I'm sure that's not what's happening. That's just where my head went on this.
Well, thanks to the power of the internet, Apple II users everywhere have access to cool devices from Korea to Bulgaria and everywhere in between.
Yeah, and it's a testament to the, we talk about it a lot, the open nature of Waz's design that 30, 40 years later we can still come up with new and interesting things for the Apple II to do.
Pretty amazing. So speaking of Apple II internals, those of us who like to program these machines have hopefully by now all acquired Chris Torrance's excellent book, Assembly Lines, the complete book. I have certainly been thoroughly enjoying my hardcover copy. Thanks once again, Chris, for that. If you have not purchased a hardcover copy, or perhaps you have, but you also want the PDF, which I personally also love a PDF for reference on my iPad, the PDF version is now available on archive.org for free. How amazing is that?
That's really great. And Chris has a little video, if you go to the webpage, of him talking about kind of how the book came about and his work with Roger Wagner. I know when we had him on the show a few months back, right before the book came out, and that was a great interview, and he was a lot of fun to talk to. And one of the things that he brought up was he wasn't sure whether he would do an ebook version and what that might look like, and it looks like this. And so we thank you, Chris, for making this resource available to us.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have been waiting for this. If you want to learn assembly language programming on the Apple II, I can't think of a better book, honestly. This thing is just fantastic. I've really, really been enjoying it. And I think the main reason for me personally to download this is because I want to see if I can make the cursor flipbook in the corner work by scrolling really fast on my iPad. For anyone who missed it, we talked about that last month, how there seems to be an Easter egg in the lower right corner of Chris's book. If you do kind of like a flipbook sort of thing with the pages, you get the Apple II's blinking cursor in the corner, and it's awesome.
And of course, Chris hasn't written in to confirm that, but we're pretty sure that's what's going on.
Yeah, Dagan called it out on the Facebook page, Dagan Brock, sort of local 2GS celebrity, and I had also noticed it. In fact, Dagan called it out on the Facebook page while we were recording last month's episode.
Maybe he was listening.
Yeah, well, yeah, it hadn't gone out yet, but yeah, maybe he's hiding in my closet.
God, I hope not. All right, so next is a project from somebody named Jason Griffiths, he looks like he has the apple2oz.com domain. Not somebody I had heard of before, but he is developing a version of Apple II Pong and is looking for developers to help him out. It's, I guess, going to be an open source Pong game. So what do you think about this, Quinn?
This is pretty interesting. It's interesting to see people doing kind of collaborative open source projects on the Apple II. That's a very modern concept. We have all these modern tools for collaborative open source development, things like GitHub and SourceForge and so on. So it's interesting to see someone do this with an old Apple II project, but also with something as interesting or as sort of basic as Pong. And I think this could be a really great learning experience for anyone who wants to, get the experience of collaborative software development and also learn some basic software development. So it looks like he's writing it in Integer Basic, which is a fun, very entry-level kind of programming project that will run on, I guess, every Apple II in history. I think Integer Basic is the lowest common denominator, I think. He's got a prototype up and running, and he's got a list of new features that he's looking for help from people to write. So if you're looking to get your feet wet with Integer Basic, this looks like a fun, collaborative way to do it. So speaking of programming projects, Bill Buckles has been very busy with double high-res graphics.
Yeah, so he's been working on this BMP to SHR conversion program.
I think it's actually BMP to DHR, isn't it?
Well, this particular one is called, the message in front of me says that he's rewriting a program called BMP to SHR. So this might actually be one of his earlier programs for
this is
super high res on the 2GS.
Okay.
And he's rewriting that and has been making some good progress. Has been posting pictures and talking about the development. And I think we talked a little bit about one of his other programs, maybe the DHR one, in another episode. And you kind of mentioned that this is, basically it's a whole lot of color theory. So if you're into that sort of, if you like nerding out about color theory and that sort of thing, this is a great thing to follow along.
Yeah, so not to be confused, as I just did, with BMP to DHR, which is Bill's double high-res conversion program for BMPs, which for anyone who doesn't know, BMP is it's a common modern image format that you'll see on PCs and sometimes Macs. And so he's been working on these utilities for converting to double high-res, and he's been kind of doing like a picture-a-day thing on the Apple II Enthusiasts Facebook page. So it's fun to see all the different images that he's been converting, and they look great.
And in this particular case, the output is for Apple IIgs super high-res mode, so that's pretty cool.
The graphics mode that rules them all.
That's right.
I'm sure we've talked about this before, but one of my favorite things about the 2GS, well, obviously the super high-res graphics, but it was more than that. There's lots of computers that have, from that era, that have fancy graphics modes, but the super high-res mode as a programmer is exactly what you always wanted a graphics mode to be. It's this big solid block of linear memory that has just the palette entries in it and scanline interrupts, and it does everything you want. There's no artifacting, there's no strange rules about what colors can go where. It does everything seamlessly as far as palette animation goes and so on. It's exactly the graphics mode you want. A lot of the other machines of the time that had fancy graphics, like the Amiga and the Atari ST and so on, while they were capable of impressive displays, the graphics hardware was a lot more complex. They used bit planes, or they used palettes on different palettes on different parts of the screen that you had to coordinate, or they had various other sort of tricky requirements to make the pretty graphics. So the 2GS was literally just a big block of pixels, and you shoved them out and they appeared on the screen, and it was awesome. So hooray for super high res. If only the machine had been a little faster, it would have been the perfect machine.
Well, with the new Transwarp GS coming out, it can be the perfect machine.
Full circle. Nicely done, Mr. Regas. All right, well, speaking of none of that, I see something very cool going on archive.org. That's my fallback segue there. Let's talk about 4am.
Yeah, so if you're not following 4am on Twitter, you're really doing yourself a disservice as an Apple II fan.
Definitely.
We don't really know who 4am is, and that's part of the fun, I think. But this person, he or she, has been hard at work cracking a huge amount of Apple II software, most of which has not been cracked before or has been badly cracked. So parts of the program are missing, or it breaks when you walk into a certain bar in a certain area. 4am's collection is, and I think it's probably been available on archive.org for a while now, but we haven't really talked about it. So if you go over to archive.org and take a look, you can get not only all of the cracked versions of the software that have been released, but nice write-ups on how the cracks were done. And there was a tool developed that I think the original dmuffin program, which was sort of a modified version of Muffin, and dmuffin has been patched again, not only to fix a couple of bugs, but make it easier to automate these cracks. That tool that 4am is using is available as well. And it looks like as of tonight, there are 279 items in this collection. And a lot of it's, the educational software stuff that you would never touch with a 10-foot pole, but there's some really great stuff in there as well. For example, like when I was younger, there was a game, there's a game called Jungle Hunt, and on the Apple II, the crack screen spelled hunt differently. And it was offensive, and my father saw that and said, "Give me that disc," and destroyed it, and I was not allowed to play that. And 4am has a cracked version of Jungle Hunt that doesn't include that screen, so I can travel back to 1983 and give that to my 12-year-old self and say, "Here, show this to your dad."
Yeah, this is fantastic. I absolutely love 4am's Twitter feed. I'm not actually on Twitter, but if I was going to join, this would be the reason. I was never a cracker back in the day, but I was fascinated by it. I didn't understand how people did that. And so 4am's Twitter feed is just cracking 101. It's taking you to school on how this is done. 4am goes into just gory detail on every single crack, and it's like a live blog of each game that they're working on. So you get to see the whole process step by step, and 143 characters at a time. It's really fantastic. And not only that, I mean, this is clearly, whoever this person is a hardcore Apple II fan. Their location is listed as "I live on track 0." And their avatar is the satire floppy disk treatment icon from the Beagle Brothers. We talked about that with Mark last month, how they had those funny icons, and one of them was showing you should not feed your floppy disks to alligators. So 4am's Twitter avatar is that icon from the Beagle Brothers software. It looks like as of this recording, 4am is working on Championship Loadrunner. They say, "God, I love Broderbund bootloaders, and by love, I mean hate, and by hate, I mean admire." So it gives you a taste. And just the post just before that looks like 4 hours sooner. So they're plugging away here. 4 hours before that, the post reads, "Championship Loadrunner sets both input and output vectors to B7, B5, then calls them to read level data because at Roland Gust is insane." So it gives you a little taste of the level of detail that you're going to get in this Twitter feed. So if you wanted to know a little bit about cracking and how it goes, this is just a dream come true, this Twitter feed. Absolutely love it.
Broderbund, I think, was one of those companies that noticed early on that people were stealing or cracking and pirating their software, and decided to take an active stance against that, and kept coming up with more interesting and devious ways to protect their disks. And every time an article would appear in Computist on how to crack something, or a title would show up on your local favorite pirate BBS, they would go and change the protection and not update version numbers or anything. It's just that the stuff that you bought at the store after that came out, the cracks no longer worked.
Yeah, that was pretty sneaky stuff. So we'll link to the Twitter feed here, and also, of course, the 4am collection on archive.org.
We've talked about Joe Eli a few times on this podcast. He, of course, released that album B484 that was made on an Apple II with a MIDI card and a drum machine. He made it back in '83. It wasn't released because his record company didn't know what to do with it. He re-released it. He released it himself in 2014. Finally, the originals, and he announced over on his Facebook page a week or two ago that there were some more tracks that were not included with the digital release that you can get on iTunes. They're going to release a CD pressing later this year, and those extra tracks will be included on that. And as I was reading this, I noticed, again, I saw that Woz wrote the liner notes for this original album, but if you go to iTunes and buy it, you'll notice that there are no liner notes. That was kind of disappointing, I thought, but if you go over to Rackham Records Info, which I think is the record label that Joe is releasing this on, Steve Woz's letter that he wrote to be included in the liner notes is there for you to read. And it's pretty cool. It talks about kind of the history, because I guess one of the things that Joe did when he wasn't out on tour or recording was he ran an Apple II BBS, and Woz would call into it late at night and they would chat back and forth. And so that's sort of interesting to see some of those reminiscences from Woz.
We're going to need a Joe Eli section on the show pretty soon.
I think so.
So tell me, Mike, if I wanted to know more random facts about Steve Jobs' childhood home, where would I go to do that?
Well, Quinn, you could go to slate.com. This is an article that was written by a woman named Megan Chovanec, who is the granddaughter of the stepmother of Steve Jobs. She married Paul Jobs, Steve's adoptive father, after his mother died, and spent a lot of her time in the famous Steve Jobs house where the garage is. And she wrote up a little article. I guess it was originally for Zocalo Public Square, which I think she goes to like UCLA or something like that, and that's their campus newspaper. And Slate picked it up and reprinted it, and she kind of talks about her memories of, why the house is significant to her, not because of the history of Apple, but because of the family memories that she has there. And she kind of wraps it up by saying that the garage these days is filled with her grandmother's laundry and car, and most of the original stuff from the garage is gone, except, of course, for the cement floors and like a couple of shelves.
Wow, that's riveting stuff.
Especially since the garage doesn't actually have much significance in Apple history, as was mentioned last year.
That's right, yeah. As we broke here on this very show, the news that the garage was really not such a thing.
The garage is a lie.
Yeah, the garage is a lie. Well, apropos of nothing, I'm a big fan of Slate. One of my favorite authors on there, Phil Plait, is also there on Slate. He talks about lots of science and technology types of things. So maybe our listeners might like to go look up Phil Plait while you're over there on Slate.
And it's easy to remember because it rhymes.
Yeah, see, yeah, great minds think alike. All right, well, I think that about wraps up our news, does it not?
I think so. I don't see any other items on our spreadsheet here. So why don't we move to Weird Gaming?
Let's do it.
You know Choplifter, you know Load Runner, but do you know this? It's time for a weird game.
All right, I am seeing Omega for your pick. What is that?
Yeah, all right, I'll start since you kicked the ball my way. So this was a game that I think it was actually fairly popular. So again, one of these games that is not necessarily weird in the you've never heard of it sense, but perhaps weird in the just sense that it was an unusual game in its own right. So the gist of it is it's this futuristic tank combat game. So you're battling an opponent. Each of you has a tank in an arena, and the arena is fairly large, and there's obstacles, there's trees and rocks and stuff in it, and your tanks drive around. The hook is that the tanks are autonomous, and you build these tanks by setting up the equipment that you want on it, choosing from various types of equipment, and then you actually write the code that drives the tank. And so they have this kind of built-in programming language, and there's a full-screen text editor and everything. And so you write the code in this kind of made-up language they've created, and then so each of you can write your own tank AI, if you like. It would be sort of artificial intelligence, for lack of a better word. And so you would each write this on your own Apple II, and then you can both bring your floppies together on one machine and put your tanks into the same arena and fight them against each other. And whoever wrote the better tank AI wins. I think this is the first, or at least a very early example of this type of gameplay, this sort of programming as gameplay type of thing. And it's really interesting to me because this idea comes back every few years. I think there's a game on the Mac called Robot Wars, and there's a bunch of them on iOS right now. It's an idea that gets recycled every so often. And what I think is funny about it is it just never works very well. It's never as popular as I think people think it will be. And my theory on that one is that, programmers who are, of course, making these games are so fascinated by programming themselves that they assume, well, if I think programming is so fascinating. Everybody must think so, right? So I'm going to make a game where programming is the game. And yeah, it turns out most people don't really like programming. And these games, like I say, just never do well. Sometimes they're dressed up with, icons that you drag around to make your program. But sometimes, like this game, you're literally writing text. You're writing source code in this kind of pseudocode type language. And so that's not even giving you something pretty to look at while you're doing it. You're literally writing code. So it's funny. It's funny that every few years this gets tried again, and it's never very successful. But if you are interested in this type of thing, Omega is a really excellent implementation of it. It's really nicely done. It's a great looking game. The code editor, even, for example, it's not a text screen like you would imagine. It's actually in high-res graphics. So they've actually written a text rendering engine, complete with cursor, backspace, the whole 9 yards fonts and everything. So they went to the trouble of doing all that in high res. You write your code in there, and the top-down view of the arena where the tanks are fighting looks great. It's just the production values are awesome on it. Really nicely done. If you're interested in this weird sort of concept of writing code as gameplay, this is a great early example of it. I don't suppose you ever played this, Mike?
I did actually. Played quite a bit.
Oh, is that right?
I had a lot of fun. My friends and I used to kind of compare it to sort of it's like a chess game for the Apple II for people who are tired of just playing chess.
Yeah, that's not a bad way to look at it. Yeah, I had one friend who was also interested in programming, and we played this together quite a bit. It was probably the one and only time I ever had a lot of fun with one of these games, because it's difficult to find another person who also wants to do this sort of thing. And it's a great example also of what we talked about in a previous show about that kind of soft skill educational software, where, like in Search of the Most Amazing Thing or the Haley Project, where you can have a lot of fun doing something and you're actually learning a lot in the process. You're learning these basic skills of debugging and analyzing a problem and thinking through how to solve it with code, while playing a game. It's the kind of thing, if you tried to make an educational game to do this, it would be awful and transparent and kids would hate it. But if you actually just try to make a good game out of programming tanks, it turns out it's fun to play and you learn a lot doing it. So if there's any parents out there who are exposing their kids to Apple IIs, this would be a really great game for that. And it also plays great in Virtual 2, the online Apple II emulator, so we'll link to that. 2
thumbs up from the Open Apple crew.
Huzzah! So what have you got for us, Mike?
Well, this one's not quite 2 thumbs up for anybody, I don't think. But it was the first real exposure I had playing an Infocom game on my Apple II, and that was Infidel. It was 1983, early in 1983, so definitely a little bit later in the line of games. And I remember that the copy that I had was the 40-column all-in-caps version of the game, which made it difficult to read. You couldn't play it for very long. Your eyes just kind of bugged out after a while. So Infocom is a little bit different, though, than the rest of Infidel is different than the rest of the Infocom pantheon, because most of the games tend to have you take the step into the avatar of a sympathetic character or one that you can like and love. And this one, you play a grave robber, and not a good one. Your local crew has deserted you on your quest. You're in Egypt, and you're basically robbing a pyramid, an ancient Egyptian pyramid for treasure. And the game itself, the mechanics are kind of bland, but it goes the extra above and beyond to insult you at every step, every mistake that you make. And so I really kind of enjoyed it. It was written by Mike Berlin, who also did Cutthroats and Suspended, and I think may have done 1 or 2 other games. He did a lot of adventure games over his career, a few with Infocom before moving on to other companies. My favorite Infocom games tend to be the non-puzzlers. I like Trinity, and I like Mind Forever Voyaging a lot more than, say, Suspended or Planetfall or something like that. But I really enjoyed this one because it was a first experience for me with Infocom, and because it was a different tack than most of their storylines took.
For sure. This is a great example of some of the really experimental and out there stuff that Infocom was doing. I think both because they were trying really, really hard to get their products seen as, the new form of literature, And also just because of the medium, being a text adventure, you don't have to animate or illustrate any of this stuff, any of these concepts. You can really go outside the box. You can do all kinds of crazy concepts like this that would never fly in any other type of game. And this is a great example of some of the pretty oddball stuff they were doing over there.
The game itself is kind of hit or miss in terms of play. Like I said, the puzzles are sort of bland and straightforward, and part of it, so you have to descend into the pyramid and figure out how to get out, and part of that is to decipher these hieroglyphics, but the way that it's implemented, you don't actually have to do that puzzle to beat the game. So there's kind of some missteps in there, and overall it adds up to being a slightly above average but not great Infocom game. Over at the Digital Antiquarian, Jimmy Marr has a nice write-up on the history of it, and as with everything he writes over there, it's in-depth and fascinating, and I highly suggest you check that out as well. And of course, you can play it on your favorite emulator.
And we'll link to that article in the show notes if you ever wanted to know anything about Infocom. Look no further than the Digital Antiquarian. Jimmy Marr is crushing it over there.
Well, that and GetLamp, of course.
Yes, of course. All right, well, that wraps up Weird Gaming, I think. We've got some feedback. Let's dive into that.
You've listened to us talk. Now it's time to tell us what you think.
So this is, we've got a little bit of catching up to do. We've got some older feedback that has been gathering dust. My apologies for that. As the wrangler of our emails, I have been dropping the ball a little bit here. So a while back on the show, we were talking about, I forget what the topic was, but it involved mentioning Atari a lot, and I managed to throw a Boo Atari in every time. And that's a bit of an inside joke, I think, in the Apple II community that I think got started with Jason Scott at KansasFest. He had done a presentation involving a bunch of slides, and obviously it was, from an Apple II perspective, but a lot of the slides had Atari content in them, and he had written in the corner of all the slides, he'd written Boo Atari every time there was an Atari on the screen, and of course we all got a chuckle out of that. So I particularly found that amusing and have been doing that ever since. And so I was doing that on a previous episode, and that got the attention of one of our cousin podcasts, if you like. Rob over at the Player Missile podcast sent us a note saying, so, did an Atari run over someone's dog? Apple people bashing Atari is like General Motors complaining that DeLorean is taking away market share. That's that's a good analogy. I like that. So he says, I'm an Atari podcaster, yet regular listener to your show. That's good. You're trading up. I especially enjoy the in-depth technical content and great interviews. But as I found out when interviewing Paul Hagstrom to get a primer on Apple II graphics, there's more in common between the systems than you might think. They run approximately the same speed and have similar high-res modes, similar enough that Apple II high-res games can be ported fairly easily to the Atari. Although to make up for all the anti-Atari snark, I'd be remiss in saying that it doesn't work the other way around, as the Atari half a generation later has specialized coprocessors for graphics and sound. So he says, can we all just agree that you should direct your snark at the C64? Well, good news and bad news. Good news is I will continue to direct snark at the Commodore 64, Rob. The bad news is there's more than enough snark to go around, so Boo Atari. And he says, wish I could have made it to your talk out here in the Bay Area on Veronica. Maybe you'll present at KansasFest again. Well, I'm afraid that won't be happening. It was tremendous fun to bring Veronica to KansasFest last year, but it was also tremendously challenging logistically, so I don't imagine I'll be doing that again.
Pleading for mercy only makes it worse, Rob.
It really does. It's best just to ignore me. But actually, I'm glad he brought this up because, I hope nobody's ever genuinely offended by my snark or takes it seriously. It's a bit of a funny thing to me because, those of us who grew up in the original microcomputer wars, especially, as teenagers, it was actually quite a big deal. I was pretty deep into it myself at the time. I actually took that quite seriously, took it very personally.
Yeah.
And it's something that still happens to this day. People pick a particular consumer product, whether it's, iPhone or Android or Mac or PC or whatever the turf war du jour is. And, that human instinct for tribalism is just so incredibly strong that people will get really personally invested in arbitrary consumer product choices. And I find that fascinating. So, looking back on it now, of course, it's just incredibly silly and ridiculous, the amount of energy that I wasted getting offended or otherwise worked up about people who used particular computers or other particular computers. And so I like to make fun of it now as a reminder of how silly it all was.
How silly it all still is, because it happens every day with iOS and Android.
Yes. Well, and, it gives you perspective. I think those of us that grew up in what was maybe the first of these tribalistic consumer electronics wars, now I can look at the current iOS-Android war and just laugh it off as all just silly. I mean, use whatever device you like, and who cares whatever other people like. Different devices, they're good at different stuff. Just pick the one you like, and,
That's right. Your phone does not define you.
Exactly. You don't have to die on a hill for your smartphone selection. You really don't, folks. But those of us who grew up in the microcomputer wars have made that mistake already. Perhaps the kids today have not. So they got to learn the hard way.
Except for those dumb Commode OR users.
Yes, well, serves them right. Yeah, no, it's all fun and games, but of course the Apple II, as we all know, is in fact the best machine of them all.
That's right. That's why we can say it's fun and games, because we're the best.
And we'll get hate mail, I'm sure, once the Commodore users finish.
Send it to me.
Yeah, don't worry, you'll never get it. The Commodore users are still waiting for their email programs to load.
Oh no!
Yeah. I had to get one in there somehow. That was a little forced, but
Zing.
Try. All right, moving right along. Listener Mike, not you, Mike, another Mike, writes in to say, hello, hey, Quinn and Mike. I listened with interest to the discussion about the things you would want to have on your last 10 floppies. Yeah, we had another listener write in and ask what he should put on his 10 floppy disks. And he was looking specifically for utilities and not games. So we talked about different types of, and we talked about Copy 2 Plus and System Masters and various things. And we mentioned terminal programs as well, since they're not just useful for BBSs, but useful for many things in modern life. And he says, far from being made, I was dismayed, the very opposite of made. He talks like Carrington. Yes, it could indeed be harder to use an old terminal program to POTS line dial out to BBSs, which I assume is telecommunications jargon for the old-style landlines. But you can still relive the BBS experience rather easily if you want. It takes a few odds and ends, such as a no modem cable and adapter, or devices like the Lantronix serial drivers or the Raspberry Pi. So I assume what he's alluding to here is the way that people can sort of relive that BBS experience by hooking their Apple II into a modern computer, such as through a serial cable or through a Raspberry Pi that is then on the internet, and then use telnet. And you can kind of tunnel through telnet over the internet to BBSs that are set up the same way on the other end. And you can kind of get a lot of that experience that way. I guess it's something that we haven't talked a lot about. Have you ever tried that, Mike?
I have, yeah. It works pretty well. I don't know that there are that many telnet BBSs out there. There are a few, and there are a few Apple II/retro computing centric ones that are fun to check out. I think part of the problem is when these things get announced, everybody signs up, goes there once, posts something like hi, and then never posts again.
Yeah.
So they turn into virtual ghost towns fairly quickly. But of course, the big thing is, does this solution emulate the satisfying dial-up sound of a 300 baud modem connecting?
The experience feels like it wouldn't be the same. I guess I haven't tried it. Now, having said that, I haven't tried that myself with the telnet thing. I have tried some of these telnet BBSs through the browser. They usually have a browser interface as well, which is, of course, cheating. And, by that route, it doesn't bring back that BBS feeling at all. But I've thought about one of my side projects that I'll probably never get to is I've thought about building some sort of box that would replicate the landline in between two modems. So you could, somewhere like KansasFest, if you had multiple Apple IIs and if people could bring their modems and plug them in, this box would actually generate dial tones and so on and do everything that, more or less that the landline would have been doing. And the modems would be none the wiser, so you could actually run, ProTerm on one end and real BBS software on the other and have that experience.
There's definitely a lot of the, ignore the man behind the curtain going on here, where you just kind of have to, I'll just push the Raspberry Pi behind the monitor here where I can't see it and pretend that this is an actual dial-up experience.
Yeah.
It's certainly not, but if you're willing to ignore a few things and look the other way, then, yeah, you can kind of relive that experience a little bit.
Yeah, there was a real magic to modem dialing. That it was that anticipation. Because you didn't know, are you going to get a busy signal?
Right.
Like that. After that dialing finished and it started ringing instead of getting a busy signal, that was the best sound in the whole world. You've been probably dialing this BBS for an hour or more and just waiting for it to ring. And when it rang and then connected, what a rush that was! I remember that so well.
And then if you were really lucky, the sysup was around and he would break into chat and you could actually have real-time chat with somebody instead of just posting and replying to messages that had been left.
Totally. Yeah, in fact, some friends of mine and I in junior high school, we used to chat on our Apple IIs. We would actually just dial in directly to each other and chat as you would, nowadays on something like Jabber or, an instant messaging program or even like texting nowadays. We would actually do that with our modems because there's, if you want to, as a teenager, you want to have a personal conversation about teenager stuff. It's easier to do writing than talking, especially for nerdy types like we were. So we used to do that, and that was fun. All right, moving along. Thanks for that, Mike. And, you know what? Actually, there's one more bit here, I guess. He says, as a matter of fact, I'm visiting with Michael Sternberg this weekend, and we're going to get an Apple IIc and other 8-bit machines talking to a variety of BBSs in this way, talking about the Raspberry Pi telnet process again. We're going to have fun calling DJ's Place BBS, and while you guys pretend you can't call BBSs with your ProTerm. He says he's kidding, but he has to try and keep up with the Chief Sarcasm Officer, which of course is me. Let's see, so he talks about it's a very personal decision whether ProTerm or AE is worth using up a 5¼ floppy, but if you want to try calling BBSs, then go for it. And like we talked about last time, of course, it's also useful for talking to your Arduinos and other types of serial devices. So, yeah, interesting stuff. Thanks for that, Mike. All right, the last one I've got here is from Hugh, and he says, so this was an interesting one. So Hugh wrote to ask, with regards to our Beagle Brothers roundtable, he says it was terrific. Thanks for that, Hugh. He says, I think that even if my house had caught on fire during the middle of that, I'd have to keep listening. Well, luckily that didn't happen. I don't know if your insurance would cover death by Beagle Brothers roundtable. He says, thanks also, Quinn, for asking Alan about some of the timeout technical specifics. My pleasure. He asks, one timeout trivia question that I wish had been asked. All timeout programs have a signature consisting of the hex bytes 0B02E12644. And he asks, was that series of numbers just random, or did it actually mean something? Well, that is a really interesting question, Hugh. And we tried to find that out for you. In fact, we wrote to Randy Brandt, who, of course, was he's kind of a regular on the show, actually, and asked him that very question. And he then went on to ask Alan, who had written that part of the timeout stuff. And Alan could not remember, unfortunately, but they were pretty sure that it was actually an arbitrary series of bytes. It was a signature that marked the start of a timeout module. And apparently it was just an arbitrary sequence of bytes. They needed a sequence that would identify the modules uniquely. So unfortunately, it does not appear to be the name of anyone's dog or anything otherwise funny in that sense. But interesting question, Hugh. Thanks for that. That's all the feedback I have. Did you have any, Mike?
No feedback here. People don't like me. They send stuff to you.
Well, yeah. We don't read the hate mail online, so otherwise.
That's true. I do have a lot of that.
Do please continue to send Mike your hate mail, folks. He really appreciates it.
That's right. I am the hate sponge.
If it wasn't for your bad attention, he wouldn't get any at all.
Aw.
All right. Well, let's move on to tech, shall we?
Fasten your seat bits and warm up your soldering irons. It's time to talk tech.
So I've got one quick tech item this month. I've been hard at work on my TeddyTop project, which I've talked about here on the show before. To recap, it is a cap, in fact. It's a sort of plastic shell that I'm building that goes on top of an Apple IIc or IIc Plus, and it has a display built into it and sort of attempts to turn your Apple IIc into a KansasFest going laptop, or I suppose also Starbucks going if you were hipster enough to take your Apple II into a Starbucks.
Oh, God.
If you're that hipster, I'm going to punch you, by the way. Nevertheless, I'm having fun.
And take their Apple II.
Yes, and take your Apple II and maybe your lunch money. Because if you're hipster enough to do that, then I can probably take you. So anyway, the TeddyTop is going swimmingly along, for lack of a better word. I've recently added support for flash storage to it. So the idea is to make my Apple IIc into something that is a road warrior of sorts that can go to KansasFest or wherever else I might like to take it, not a Starbucks, and have everything that I need built into it. So it's got the display, and I've talked about that previously. I've also documented that process on my blog, which I will link to in the show notes because I'm into the shameless self-promotion. And I recently picked up one of the Nishida Radio's Unis disc, or Uni S disc, however we've decided to say that. Picked up one of those awesome devices. I was lucky enough to get one before he went on hiatus. And I slightly dismantled it and re-engineered it a little bit and kind of worked it into the Teddy Top. So the Teddy Top now has a slot in it that takes an SD card, and hiding in there is the Nishida Radio board.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, so it's nice. That way I can take all of my software with me as well and not have to cart around lots and lots of floppy disks. Not being satisfied there, I quickly realized, well, this is awesome. Now I can take Lode Runner everywhere I go. And then I remembered, oh, wait, Lode Runner and most other Apple II games are basically unplayable without a joystick. I had actually kind of forgotten how important a joystick is for Apple II gaming. So I set out to solve that problem. And I thought this idea was pretty clever. Turns out I'm not the first person to have it, because I started Googling and found out that our own Apple II community member, Dagan Brock, has actually already done this, and possibly others as well. But in any case, darn it, take all my ideas before I had them. But in any case, I decided to do it anyway, and I wrote up my take on this project on my blog, which I will also link to. So the idea is to create a portable joystick for the Apple II that will go along with the Teddy Top. And, portable joysticks are something that are commonplace nowadays in modern gaming consoles. We have these gamepads that have analog joysticks in them. Of course, the challenge with the Apple II is that the joystick is analog, so you can't make something as compact as a digital gamepad, because you need analog sticks. The thought was, well, let's take one of those modern small analog sticks and add a couple of buttons to it and make it into a portable joystick. So I've started prototyping that, and I got that working. The main challenge there for the hardware folks among our listeners, the main challenge there, of course, is that the Apple II's analog joystick uses a 150 kiloohm potentiometer for each axis. And 150 k-ohms is a weird size that nobody makes anymore. And once again, darn it, Woz. Of all the sizes to choose, nowadays potentiometers are only made in sort of orders of magnitude sizes, 1K, 10K, 100K, and so on. Right. And 150K is just unobtainium. And in any case, I wanted to specifically use these little mini analog joysticks, which are 10K, as luck would have it, or at least the ones that I found are. So the challenge was then how to make that work with the Apple II. And I go into all the gory details on my blog entry, but the short version is that because the Apple II's joystick is a pulse counter, the resistance in the joystick is used to speed up or slow down a train of pulses, which are then counted in the machine. What you can do is, so the pulse counting, or the pulse train is sped up and slowed down with an RC circuit, a resistor capacitor circuit. And as any beginning electrical engineering student knows, an RC circuit has a time constant, and that's what determines how quickly the circuit charges and discharges. And that's what the Apple II is counting as pulses. So if the resistance is too low, as it is in our case, you can compensate by increasing the capacitance. As long as the resulting time constant is the same, then the circuit will behave the same, and the Apple II won't know the difference. So I describe in the blog post how to calculate that and how to hook it all up. And I've got schematics in there if anyone wants to do this themselves. It's still on the breadboard right now, but I'm going to attempt to make an enclosure for it, probably using the aforementioned shiny new 3D printer. Yeah, if I manage to achieve all that, I will, of course, share all of the files and so on online so everybody else can try and make their own.
Can't wait.
Should be fun. And I did try it out, actually, and it works great. I played Lode Runner for the first time, I think, in actually about 25 years, because I've never had a joystick hooked up to any of my laptops or modern computers, so I could never really play Lode Runner in an emulator either. It was really, really great, actually, to play it again with the joystick and the breadboard and the wires everywhere. And it was funny. I've got video of me doing this on the blog, so I'll link to that. But it was a real thrill, actually, to play Lode Runner for realsies once again.
Awesome.
So that's all I've got for tech this month.
Okay, and I think that brings us to the end of our show.
I think it does.
All right. Well, thank you again to Paul Lutus for joining us with some really great stories of AppleWriter and beyond. And thank you, Quinn, for podcasting with me and everybody else for listening along.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. And hopefully we'll see all of our listeners at KansasFest. Run, don't walk to sign up in April.
Every one of you better be there.
That's right.
This has been the Open Apple Podcast. Subscribe to us in iTunes or visit us at open-apple.net, where you can browse our extensive catalogue of past episodes or read our blog. If you like what you've heard today, or even if you didn't, your comments, questions or ideas are always welcome. Send them to feedback at open-apple.net.
Yeah, that was super weird.